Today, we're talking about the utterly fantastic Nikon ZR. And the great thing about this camera is... Potato? Oh, for fuck's... Hold on. Freddy? Did you put on the sticker? Did you put on a potato?
Never.
You didn't put on the potato sticker on the Nikon?
That was Gabor.
Was Gabor?
It was Gabor.
Gabor put that on?
Yes.
The mother... That's not okay. He should know by now that Nikon is not potatoes anymore.
What is it now?
The baby reds. It's a little baby red. Alright, that is so much better. So, this is the baby red. It's an absolutely adorable camera, but first and foremost, it is so cheap. I have no idea what Nikon is doing except losing money on every single Nikon ZR that they're selling. To give you some backstory about my relationship with Nikon, last year when Nikon bought Red, I was probably the first one to start calling my own Red camera a trash can. Because honestly, Nikon for the longest time, for us videographers and cinematographers, they were trash cans, they were potatoes, they were obsolete. And I was quite ready to call the Nikon ZR a trash can as well, just as I did with my own Red. But they released the specs, they released the camera, and most importantly, they showed that they cared with this enormous 4-inch camera. Now, normally a mirrorless camera, they usually have a 3-inch display. You wouldn't think 1 inch makes such a difference, but just ask your mom, she's gonna tell you. Anyway, after I saw that they added that 1 inch and also internal red raw, 6K 60 FPS, IBIS, full frame for 1,900 euro. Roughly the same in the US dollar. Absolutely insane. So actually I pre-ordered this camera. It's the first camera I ever pre-ordered, but this one I did. And it was so worth it. I'm so happy with this camera. I do have some caveats, I'll get to them later in the video, but my overall impression is just positive every single way. There is one thing that bothers me a lot, and that's because the IBIS is not magnetized, which means when the camera is not on, the IBIS, or rather the sensor, can rattle around a bit. So it sounds like a cheap paint can when you shake it. This is nothing you would normally do when it honestly doesn't really matter. Nothing is hurt by it. But in effect, you have a very expensive red potato. Baby red. The little cutie patootie. It's gonna have many names over the years, and most importantly, this is my new B camera for my Reds. I've been doing some tests and the colors look so similar if you use red raw in the Nikon camera, and of course on the Red cameras, you can barely tell a difference. The Nikon does lean a little bit to the green side when you go into the shadows, while the Red, quite ironically, actually leans into the magenta in the shadows. But I'll talk a lot more about this later in the video. First, let's talk about the build quality. And it's actually quite impressive. It's so stiff and it feels really premium. There is some rubber here at the front, but it's some hard-ish silicone, so it doesn't feel cheap or like a Smallrig grip. It actually feels like it's molded to the body, which of course it is, but I don't mind it at all. Additionally, the hinge on the screen is actually quite wide and proper, so I don't feel as nervous about, like, you know, accidentally bumping into it or something and maybe breaking it. It feels properly well built. It is a magnesium body, which means that the thermals are absolutely fantastic. But in its essence, this camera does not overheat, even if you shoot in 6K 60 FPS. The biggest mention and the first thing people say when they see this camera is, wow, it's so big.
Oh, wow, it's so big.
And they're actually not talking about my member. They're talking about the screen size. As I mentioned before, it's a huge screen. You think 1 inch doesn't make such a difference, but it's a really big screen. Like, I have this R5 right here. That's a 3-inch screen. This is a 4-inch screen. It's such a huge difference, and I cannot imagine going back to a 3-inch screen anymore.
Oh, we can.
Whoa. Holy shit.
That's pretty.
Whoa,
Oh, wow, it's so
so
big.
big. That is
That's
massive.
nice. That is nice.
That is
for
actually
the
really
eye.
nice. You don't need to have a monitor. This is actually really nice. I didn't expect to like it as much as I would.
oh, it's just 1 inch, but apparently that's all you need.
Yeah. Footage actually, like put it in DaVinci and play
Funny,
around.
he would look at me like that.
That goes in the review.
The thing is, this camera has a micro HDMI port, which you would think you would care about that because, oh no, I cannot rig a monitor, I cannot rig a follow focus system. I don't care at all. You don't need a DirectX monitor. You don't need to send a signal to a focus puller because the autofocus works so good. But most importantly, if you're using a manual lens yourself, you don't need an external monitor. You don't need to use the HDMI port. I'm probably never ever going to use it. Because the screen is so fucking big, you don't have to... Listen, I have a 5-inch screen on the Red, which is like a good size, and this is a 4-inch screen. You would think it's a massive difference, but when you get up into the sizes, it's not that big of a difference. I have no issue whatsoever pulling focus on this 4-inch screen. No issue. On 3-inch screens, yeah, I need focus peaking. I need to look 2 centimeters away. Am I in focus? And then I look at the footage on my big monitor and I wasn't in focus. I'm not having that problem with this camera, and it is fan-fucking-tastic. Some other ports, we do of course have the microphone import, which I do have to say, the camera does have 32-bit float audio, but if you're sending that audio over an analog cable, might not be the best results depending on what you're sending it from. For example, the DJI Mic 3, my new favorite microphone. The thing is, that microphone is not able to send out such a wide band that you can fully utilize the 32-bit float audio. Also, because you're sending a wireless signal from the microphone to the receiver, you're not getting the full benefit of the built-in 32-bit float. But if you're using a hardwired microphone, so let's say you have a shotgun microphone like I have up here, then yeah, absolutely, you can use the 32-bit float, which is such a nice thing to have because you cannot fuck it up. And the thing is, if you're using this camera as your main camera, most probably you're doing shoots alone and you're doing audio, you're doing lights, you're doing video, you're setting up the scene, you're probably instructing the talent as well. And just plugging the audio in and not having to bother with it after that is such a nice thing to have. Moving on, we do also have a headphone port, which also doubles as a remote port. As I mentioned before, we do have the micro HDMI port. Not a favorite, but at least there is an HDMI port, and as I mentioned before, I'm probably never gonna use it anyway, so it doesn't really matter for me. And finally, we have a USB-C port, which can take power delivery. Let's go! This means that when you're doing some long interview, the internal battery that only lasts around 1.5 hours in optimal conditions doesn't really matter. Just bring a V-mount or some other power bank that can deliver USB PD. I'm gonna guesstimate you need at least 20 watts. Connect it and then you can run the camera all day, no overheating. You can record for 6 hours if you so like, which you're probably not gonna be able to if you record in Red RAW, which I'll get to later in the video. It is quite a data-hungry format.
Yeah, I really don't like the grip, you know, like it gives you nothing to hold on to. And this, for example, setup, I would much rather just grab it like this because it feels more comfortable to do whatever this is, you know. I have an R50V, which is basically the same problem here with lack of grip. It just sucks.
But apparently, when you get a cage, it builds out the grip quite
exactly.
So
You need to get like an extra cage in order to do that.
So basically, to buy this camera, you have to factor in the cage, which is 100 something odd dollars.
It's really uncomfortable, yeah.
It is, yeah.
When it comes to storage, there is one thing that everyone thinks is a big gotcha. The camera has a micro SD port. And I agree, that's not great if that was the only port that existed. But on the other hand, you have a micro SD port in case you ever find yourself without a CF Express card. You should always try and use a CF Express Type B inside this camera. First and foremost, it unlocks all of the formats that you want to film in. Second of all, you can trust it a lot more than you can most SD cards. So for me, it really isn't a big deal, and it isn't really the gotcha that most people think it is. Let's talk about the image quality. Let's say, for example, you're shooting in H.265. I've seen a lot of posts on the internet, and I've seen a couple of reviewers saying that the codec is really bad. The thing is, most people have been comparing the footage to the Sony FX3, which, to be fair, it is a natural rival. But Sonys are also quite known for having a very sharp footage. And when I've been testing this myself, I've been comparing the FX3 to the Nikon ZR. So if I just wanted the footage to look equally sharp and good, I just upped the detail in the Nikon ZR footage. However, I do have to say that the data rate when you're recording in H.265 10-bit is not quite enough. So when you have a lot of movement going on in the scene, you will have some compression artifacts. However, my workaround, and what I always do anyway, is I will shoot in Red RAW, and if I ever have a very long interview, which will mean no movement in the frame, I will comfortably shoot in H.265, and if I need any additional sharpness to match some other cameras on set, I will just up the detail in my DaVinci color space workflow. With that boring thing out of the way, let's talk about the big thing and why you would pick up the little baby red. The Red RAW workflow. So you get the full red color space. The only caveat is that the readout from the sensor is in 12 bits and then the red code RAW files are in 12 bits. You wouldn't think that would matter that much because that is billions and billions of colors. But that means that the camera is not equal to the red cameras because the red cameras read out from their sensor in 16-bit, which means they have trillions of colors. You cannot really tell the difference, but that also means that it's not equal. Now mind you, the cheapest red you can pick up is 6,000 to 7,000 euro, and this one is sub 2,000 euro. So that is a compromise I'm willing to take, but that also means the image is not equal, but it is pretty damn close. If we take a little look-see towards our two shots here, they are really similar. I'm using the same lenses except for the focal range. And the only thing I see really is that the red Komodo is shifting magenta and the Nikon ZR is shifting green. Also, the Nikon ZR is losing around 2 stops of dynamic range, which isn't really that bad because, as you can see, we're still plenty exposed for the outside. So overall, I'm super happy with how it matches up, and I will gladly use this in the future.
Think about the Nikon ZR.
It's a potato.
I'm a potato.
It's always gonna be a potato.
That isn't really a big thing in my opinion. Moving on to the actual red code RAW inside of here. Unfortunately, you're not able to pick the compression ratio. And what that means is that with normal red cameras, you have a couple of options. You have ELQ, LQ, MQ, and HQ. That is just different compression ratios and means the red code RAW will be compressed different amounts. So let's say you're shooting an interview, you would probably set up ELQ because there's basically no movement in the frame, so the compression ratio can handle it. That means with 512 gigabytes on the Red Komodo X, I can record for roughly 2 hours. On this one, I can record for roughly 40 minutes. Because the data rate is so high and you cannot set the data rate. The data rate is roughly equivalent to medium quality on the Red Komodo X, as it is on this one. That means you will never be caught out using ELQ when you're shooting some fast action, which has happened to me. But it also means it's gonna eat so much data. Luckily, data storage is quite cheap, and what I always do is I film everything in the highest red RAW quality, whatever, because CF Express cards are quite cheap as well. And when I'm done with the project, I transcode everything to H.265 10-bit, and then I storage it. So I actually don't keep my red code RAW files for a long-term storage, unless it's something really special that I know is going to go in my showreel. But if I'm just archiving for a client, if I'm just, as my contract states, holding the footage for 3 years, I transcode it, and then it's not really a big issue. So please keep in mind, if you pick up a Nikon ZR and you shoot a lot of long interviews and stuff like that, use H.265 or buy a lot of SSDs. The Nikon ZR is basically a hot-rodded version of the Nikon C6 III. This means that the ZR uses the same sensor, it uses the same processor, the X-Speed whatever 7 something, but it's not as bad as it sounds. The thing is, sensor technology has been basically stagnant for the last couple of years, so having last year's sensor is not really a bad thing. For example, the Sony A7S III sensor has been in use since 2020, and it is still being produced today in the FX3, FX6, Sony CVE1, and it is among the best sensors on the market. With that said, I do have to say it is a really good sensor. For example, the readout speed is 9.3 milliseconds in 6K full frame red code RAW mode. As a comparison, the Sony FX3 has 8.8 milliseconds. So that small of a gap doesn't really make any difference whatsoever. Now, a fast readout speed means that the rolling shutter is really low. That means when you're panning, you're not getting these skewed lines you can usually get. It also means in action scenes and in motorsport, you're not gonna get any artifacts in the image. The short gist of it is basically the readout speed is great and it's nothing you really have to think about. Anything below 15 milliseconds is more than good enough. Let's talk about lenses. And this is a controversial one because one of the major things that makes me say Nikon are potatoes and one of the things that I really dislike is that when you want to mount a lens to a Nikon camera, you have to do it anti-clockwise. You wouldn't think that would matter, but as a slightly autistic person, it feels like I'm breaking the mount, I'm breaking the lens, I'm breaking the camera when I'm doing it the wrong way. It is such a stupid thing. That thing as well is that the focusing on default is the wrong way compared to Canon and Sony. It's not a big deal. In the Nikon ZR you can actually change how the focus works. It is whatever. It's just the approach that Nikon hasn't really vibed with me. With that said, you can get a Nikon lens, but because the flange distance on the Nikon C mount is so short, you can get a Sony lens. I can already hear you, oh, but you cannot use a Sony lens, the autofocus wouldn't work. No, you're totally wrong. Actually, the autofocus works just as good / just as bad, depending on your viewpoint, as the Nikon Z glass. I cannot tell any difference. I've been doing a lot of tests. They work just as good, and I think it's more dependent on the lens you're using more than the mount. So that means if you get a Nikon ZR, you have access to all of the Sony E-glass library of lenses, which thanks to Sony, Tamron, Samyang, Sigma, and many other third-party developers gives you such a huge library of glass to put on the Nikon ZR. So I myself am not going to start investing in Nikon Z glass. First of all, they're really expensive. And second of all, I don't think I will ever use it for anything else. But if I ever do need another lens for the camera, I can just pick up a Sony E version of it and use it without any issues whatsoever. It is such a fantastic thing about the Nikon Z mount, and it's really why I picked it up in the first place. If I would have been stuck with Nikon glass, I'm not quite sure I would have made the jump actually. When it comes to the IBIS, it does work very well. There are two settings, normal and sport. Neither of them crops into the sensor, they just behave differently. You can also enable electronic IBIS, which means the IBIS will crop into the sensor and use sensor stabilization, electronic stabilization, and it is utterly smooth. The IBIS actually works great on Nikon cameras. I am surprised it works this good because I've been using Canon cameras for a long time, which still to this day have this problem of the IBIS wobbles in the corners of the screen when you have a wider lens. Unfortunately, I do not have a lens that is less wide than 20mm, but even down to 20mm, as far as I've been testing, no corner wobbles, and it's utterly stable. I'm not gonna say it's Panasonic levels of stability, but it's not that far away either. So, good job, Nikon. When it comes to high-speed shooting, you can shoot up to 240 FPS in 1080p, but you have to do it in H.265. You cannot shoot in any other format, which means you lose the red RAW, you cannot shoot in ProRes RAW, ProRes 42. None of the other formats work except for H.265. But there is a very nice upside. You can shoot in 4K 120 FPS in any of the formats, which means you get red RAW, 4K 120 FPS. When you shoot in red RAW though, it does crop in on the sensor slightly, which is a natural phenomenon when you're shooting in red RAW. Red does not want to pixel bin, instead they go pixel by pixel. So if you shoot in 4K, it crops in on the sensor until they have a 4K image. And conversely, if you shoot in 6K, it shoots on the whole sensor. Speaking of shooting on the whole sensor, open gate. I know, I said it. Open gate, open the... Yeah, you've all seen Lord of the Rings. To the point, open gate is not available on this camera, but Nikon have said that in the future they will release a firmware update that enables open gate. I'm not sure I fully trust that. I don't know what Nikon's track record is, so I remain hopeful, but for me it doesn't really matter. I don't really ever shoot anything that requires open gate. But I know a lot of people love having open gate, and I understand that. So hopefully it is coming, but if you would buy the camera today, it's not available. So what is my conclusion on the Baby Red? I love it. I simply do love it. It does have some small caveats, but for the price, it is absolutely insane. You get no overheating, 6K 60 FPS, 4K 120 FPS, red cold raw, Nikon Z mount, which means you can use Sony E-glass. You get 32-bit float audio recording. You get the enormous 4-inch screen. Like, look at the size of that baby. Like, that's what gets me going in the morning. Like, I wake up just to be, fuck yeah, I have such a huge screen. Using the camera is great. The buttons and interface is easy to use. I have no caveat. The menu is really easy to understand what's going on. It's not the typical Sony menu where you're just looking everywhere. It's easy to use. When you want to switch between photo and video, it's so quick, it goes instantly. If you've ever used a Canon R5C, you usually have to wait 5-6 seconds for it to switch over. But with an Nikon ZR, you switch and it's on automatically. Speaking of which, the boot time, like listen, I'm used to my red Komodo, and the boot time on that bastard is like 30 seconds. On this one, it's just on. It's like 1-2 seconds and it's just on. It's absolutely insane, and it's so nice to use. Sorry, I'm gonna wrap up this video. I don't want to take any more of your time. If you want my recommendation, should you buy it or should you not, you should absolutely pick one up, especially for this price. I'm fairly confident Nikon is losing money on every single ZR that they sell, but it seems like they want to break into the videography/cinematography markets, which, judging by this camera, they're absolutely succeeding at. So, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I am going to make some future videos, for example, comparing autofocus using a Sony lens and using a Nikon lens. I'm also going to make a more in-depth look into the image quality compared to the red image quality. If you want to see any of that, then please let me know so I'm more motivated to make them. Have a really nice day, and I'll see you in the next video.